everyone, and welcome back to the Introductory Astronomy Lab. This week we're going to go over spectroscopy, or the science of studying light emitted by astronomical bodies. And basically what you can use the emitted light to determine the composition of stars, stellar nebula, and different astronomical bodies in the universe. All right, so before we get into that, we have to go over what light actually is and how do we use it. Well, the first thing you need to know about light is that you can look at light as either a wave or a particle. That's an artifact of quantum mechanics. Kind of seems counterintuitive, but just go with it for now. Basically what happens is light exists as a wave, and under certain circumstances, when you measure it, it collapses into a particle, the whole wavelength, and in certain situations it's more advantageous to mathematically describe it as a particle than a wave, and vice versa. So you can describe it as either or. Now, let's start with the wave portion of light. So the electromagnetic spectrum is essentially all the wavelengths of light, or all the wavelengths that light can take. And that starts down at the low end, or the high end, I guess you should say, 10 to the second meters in length with your radio waves. All right? And that goes all the way up to 10 to the negative 11th meters for your gamma rays. All right, essentially low energy, long wavelength, very high energy, very short wavelength. And what we're going to be focusing on in particular is the visible spectrum, which exists from 700 nanometers to 400 nanometers. And basically, this is your red light, or what we perceive as red, and your blue / indigo down here. All right. Now, physicists, they use the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Everything in the spectrum. Different telescopes look at different things. We have X-rays. We have ultraviolet. This is the wavelengths that give you sunburn, by the way. We have infrared, microwave, and yeah, there's just a big spectrum. And depending on what you're trying to look at, and what you're trying to analyze, you want to use different wavelengths. Primarily, we view the sun in ultraviolet. So the sun, when we want to get visible images, as you saw in the solar rotation lab, those were all in ultraviolet. We can use the visible to determine what the sun is made up of. Microwave and radio waves, we use those to determine galactic structure, the evolution of the universe, different things that have to do with that, cosmology, all that stuff. Infrared is not used so much. That's basically, for instance, we luminesce in the infrared spectrum. That's why we have infrared sensors that can detect your body heat. Basically, and this gets into what we're going to talk about in a minute, is that depending on the temperature that you are, or that you are emitting, the temperature that you have, you're going to emit a different portion of electromagnetic radiation. So for instance, our sun is at 5,770 Kelvin. It emits primarily green-yellow light. All right, and it's a function of temperature. So basically, we're what, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. We emit in the infrared, and that's why you can use infrared goggles to see people, like the Predator. All right, so now that we went over the electromagnetic spectrum, we have to go over, we're going to split this in two parts. We're going to talk about a continuous spectrum first, then we're going to talk about the quantum nature of light, when light is more of a particle. And then we're going to go back to how you use the quantum nature of light, how it influences the spectrum of the visible light that's given off by stars and nebula, and or the light that passes through a nebula, and how scientists use that to actually get workable data. So the first thing that we need to go over is what's called a continuous spectrum. All right? And basically a continuous spectrum means that, and I'm just going to, for our purposes, I'm just going to use blue, green, and red. But a continuous spectrum means that in the visible spectrum, there are no breaks in the spectrum. There's no wavelength of light that is not emitted. All right? So there's actually yellows, oranges in here, but I'm just going to do it as green, blue, and red. Okay? So when our sun, when fusion occurs in the sun, it's going to produce a continuous spectrum of photons. So essentially, how that works is in the sun, as we went over in the solar rotation lab, the sun relies on fusion to produce the energy we have. So if you have two protons, let's say proton 1 and proton 2, right, and they fuse together. When they fuse together, and this is very simplified, so technically you could say, because it's one proton, it's the same as hydrogen, you could say hydrogen. When they fuse together, you get helium, and that gives off a photon, and those photons that are given off occur at energies all along the spectrum. All right, mostly because like I said, the temperature and the size of the sun. A larger star would still be fusing hydrogen and helium, but its visible spectrum would peak in the blue range. Larger stars are usually blue. Ours is in the green-yellow area, so somewhere in there. So that's just based on the size. But the photons that are given off by the core of the sun are in this continuous spectrum. So just all the wavelengths are represented. All right, so that's great. You can use that for a lot of different analyses. For instance, incandescent light bulbs, now they don't really sell them anymore, but the light bulbs with the filament inside, because you're essentially taking that filament, you have, let me get black. In a light bulb, you basically have positive for the electricity to come in, and a negative, and then you have kind of a filament in the middle. And essentially what you're doing is this is a big resistor, and as the electricity passes through, it heats this up, and it heats it up, heats it up, heats it up, then it starts to glow. And at that temperature, you get mostly yellow light. Or the wavelengths of light that appear to us as yellow. And that's how we use light bulbs that's the type of light bulbs that we had for very many years. This type of light bulb produces a continuous spectrum. Up above me, I have CFL lights, or fluorescent lights. They use a mixture of gases, some of it mercury, to produce the light you see. And essentially, they're going to break down much more specifically. They're not going to produce a continuous spectrum, although they do hit all of the different wavelengths. It's going to be mostly focused in red, green, and blue. And you're going to see that when you use your spectroscope. Now that we've got this down, let's go over the quantum nature of light and how this helps us. All right, so let's back up a minute and go back to the sun. So in the sun, you have your core, where most of your fusion takes place, right? And that's where your light is produced. All right, so you have your solar core, right? Stay. Right? That's where your fusion's happening. And your light that's coming off is all the continuous spectrum of light. And that's all continuous spectrum. Right? All right, so you got that continuous spectrum. However, you have the upper atmosphere of the sun. All right? And because of the gaseous nature of the sun, it's a plasma, and you have hydrogen, helium gas up there with a few other compounds. It's actually going to absorb portions of that continuous spectra. All right, so as the light passes out, only certain wavelengths are going to get through. Now you might be asking, how does gas absorb light? Well, it has to do with the quantum nature of light. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the Bohr atom. Now the Bohr atom is just a model of how the atom is set up, all right? And in the Bohr atom you have, let's just do helium with 2 protons and 2 neutrons. All right? Now, on the outside ring, or in the orbit of these protons and neutrons, our nucleus, we have electrons. All right? And we have different orbits for our electrons. So there's our first electron. Maybe we'll have another electron over here orbiting. All right? Now we call these orbits, but essentially you can think of these as energy levels. So the lowest energy level, or the lowest orbit, is the ground state. So we'll call this our ground state. All right? And when electrons get more energy, they're boosted up to the higher energy levels or the higher orbits. So let's say we have a photon coming in from the sun. This is our gas. This is our helium in the upper atmosphere of the sun. Okay? It's already been fused. It's just hanging out there. We have a photon coming in from the core. Well, the photons, because they're particles, right? They're going to impact these electrons, and they're going to impart their energy on the electrons. That's going to force the electrons, because you can't just get rid of the energy. You have to account for it. That's going to force the electron into the higher energy orbit, or the higher energy level, the first excited state. It would help if I could spell. All right? And that electron, it's going to keep that energy for a little bit, right? But it really doesn't like to stay there. It wants to move back down. So let's say it's orbited a little bit. It's going to go back down. That's right, electron. It's going to go back down. You can't just get rid of that energy. You have to account for that. So it's going to emit a characteristic photon, right? With a specific energy wavelength, whatever that is in this case. And from this, we're going to get holes in our continuous spectrum of light. So actually, when you look at the sun, you're not seeing a full spectrum of light, the continuous spectrum that's produced in the core. You're actually seeing, let's go with our red, green, and blue again. So we have our red down here, we have our green, and we have our blue. So we have our blue, just color it in. We have our green. And we have our red. All right, so there's our continuous spectrum that's emitted by the solar core. When they encounter certain elements, because those energy levels are quantized and they're always going to be the same, they're only going to absorb certain wavelengths of light. So essentially you're going to get what's called an absorption spectrum. Which certain wavelengths are cut out. Right? So there's going to be certain black lines in your spectrum where those photons, those characteristic photons, have been absorbed by the electrons. All right, and what you can do is you can look at it and you can say, okay, well, I'm missing these parts of the continuous spectrum. Maybe that element is present in the sun. But when they first looked at this, they didn't really know what they were looking for. They just saw these holes in the spectrum, and they were like, wow, what is that? So what they did is they started to test gases on Earth, and you can actually look at the sun solar prominences and see these emission spectra, which is the next thing we're going to go over. You can have an emission spectra. And this is when the photons are given off again by the electrons. So you're going to have a big black bar, essentially. I have a feeling I'm going to run out of black ink. One more minute, and we'll almost be done. Need a bigger marker. All right, so your emission spectra is basically the counterpart, or the negative to this. So essentially, just draw those lines again, right there, like that, and we'll fill it in like this. What you can do, and what our scientists actually did, is in a lab they took, say, helium gas, and they looked at the spectra that was emitted when you put electricity through here, through the gas. By doing that, excited the electrons in the helium, and they gave off their characteristic photons that corresponded to their energy levels. And once you recorded that data, and you looked at the absorption data of the sun, or the absorption spectrum of the sun, you saw, hey, whoa, look, this bar and this bar indicates maybe hydrogen is present. And this bar represents helium. And through combining these, they were able to tell what the sun is actually made of. And it's all because of that quantum nature of light, where it pushed the electrons up, the electrons absorbed the specific wavelengths of the photons. Because that electron, it can't, in the orbit, you know, you have your electron here, and it wants to get pushed up to here. Because it's quantized, it can't accept anything but that specific wavelength of light, all right? Everything else is going to pass it by. It doesn't want it. It doesn't want to have anything to do with it. But that one wavelength is going to push it up, and it's going to eat up that wavelength of light. And when you combine just what, say, helium or hydrogen emits with the absorption spectrum that's produced from the gaseous atmosphere of the sun, you can actually tell what's in the sun. And it's very reliable. We use this for a lot of, anytime we're looking at another star, we can tell exactly what it's made up of by using this. And it's really, it's amazing really that you can do this. All right, so on to the lab. So what we want to do now, this is essentially what we're looking for when you view things through your spectroscope. You're essentially going to get an emission spectrum, not really. Well, depending on what you're looking at, you're either going to get an emission spectrum or an absorption spectrum. If you're viewing a light bulb with a certain gas in it, like let's say in the in-class portion of the lab, we have a tube filled with argon, and we run an electric charge through it, and that argon gives off specific wavelengths of light. You would see that in your spectroscope. And essentially inside your spectroscope, you're going to have a scale. So mine goes from 400 to 700. And your spectroscope, it's kind of shaped like this, right? And you look down here into the spectroscope. So light comes in through the slit. You always want to hold it horizontally. And you always want to make sure that these are facing right side up. Don't hold it so that these are turned on their side or upside down. You'll know you're holding it correctly when these are right side up. The spectrum should also be directly underneath the scale. So if it's off to the side, change your viewing perspective, because it's a bit off. But the light's going to come in. There's going to be a little prism down here that's going to refract the light that we went over before. It's going to split those wavelengths of light up, and it's going to project them on the scale, which is over here. And that's essentially what you're viewing. Now, in our lab, what we're going to do is we're going to analyze certain objects to see what wavelength of light that they give off. Now, I kind of alluded to this earlier with the incandescent bulb. So there's a couple of different sources that I want you to look at. First is the sun, okay? But do not look at the sun with your spectroscope, okay? Go outside when it's daylight out, just look through it, that should be enough. You should get more or less a continuous spectrum for this one. All right. After the sun, I want you to look at the laser that we used in the refraction and the lens parameters lab. This one should be the wavelength of the laser. So about 700 nanometers, or red light. All right. Then I want you to pick 2 different bulbs. So we're going to do 4 things in total. All right. Now, I would do incandescent / an LED bulb. All right. You can look on the package and see what it is. LEDs are usually going to have kind of an opaque glass to them because LEDs are usually a point source of light. It's very jarring on your eyes to have it just in a clear container because it's like, oh, it's too bright. So they usually coat it. They kind of give it a coating to kind of make the light a little softer. Incandescent are your classic filament lights. But just look on the box of your light to see what it is. These should produce a continuous spectrum as well. All right. The incandescent mostly because, just like the sun, I mean, the light's not performing nuclear fusion, but you're heating that filament to a specific temperature to generate the light. LEDs work on a different principle, basically electrons jumping between energy levels. We won't get into that, but essentially when you look through your spectroscope, you will see a continuous spectrum. Now the most interesting, and I highly recommend that you do this, is to look at either a fluorescent light, like the big tubular lights, or the compact fluorescent lights. And they don't really sell them anymore because they had mercury in them. They did it first when we first started getting energy efficient lighting. But they're the ones that have the tubes that kind of go like this and then come back down, all right, with the glass tubes in it. I would highly recommend looking at those because what you're going to see, it's kind of like your own mini science experiment, because in class we have argon tubes filled with argon gas, or you have neon signs, and they have one specific gas or combination of gases in there that produce those colors when they're excited with current. This is very similar to that process. So there's a certain mixture of gases in here that allow for that color of light to be emitted. And just, you know, from an engineering standpoint, if you want to change the color of this, you can change the content of the gases. But you should get, so for this one, for the laser, it should be completely black, all right, except for a thin band of red. All right? You should get a thin band of red right there, because that laser is essentially exciting electrons to release light in just that band. All right? For the CFL, or compact fluorescent light, or just fluorescent lights, yeah, I should probably change that to an F. You're going to get a combination of a single strip and a continuous spectrum. So you will essentially see a red block with black lines in between. Oops. Okay. A green block. I'll get that in a second. And a blue block. That, okay? And that's really cool because it's the combination of the different gases in here that produces that. That's neat. So you want to analyze the four different types. In the lab assessment, you're going to want to give like a brief background on each one, talk about a continuous emission spectrum, an absorption spectrum, the quantum nature of light. In addition, you should have, for your data sheet, there's a spot to fill in on your data sheet where I want you to draw out the spectra from each of the letters. Now you don't have to be really precise. I don't expect like, you know, research paper grade worthy drawings, but for the continuous spectrum, just make sure it's drawn out from 700 nanometers to 400 nanometers, and take some colored pencils and fill in the main colors, right? So you have red, you have your green, lost my cap for that, you have your blue, and just make that a little bigger even though it doesn't extend that far. And then you can have your orange, yellow in there. All right, so for each one of those, just draw out your spectrum of what you saw inside until you get to your fourth one. So your first, your second, your third, and your fourth, and then give a brief description of what you saw. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the spectroscopy assessment. As usual, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. I will get back to you as soon as I can. And good luck, guys. Have fun.